Congressional negotiators have reached an agreement on a spending bill to keep the U.S. government running until 30 September. The bipartisan deal boosts military spending but does not include funding for President Donald Trump's proposed wall on the Mexico border. The reported $1 trillion deal, £770 billion, needs to be approved by lawmakers. On Friday, Congress approved a stopgap spending bill that averted a government shutdown at midnight on that day. That gave Congress one more week to work out federal spending for the last 5 months of the fiscal year. Lawmakers are expected to vote on the package in the coming days. The failure to act would have closed national parks and the monuments and laid off federal employees. The last shutdown, in 2013, lasted for 17 days. What is at stake? Full details of the agreement on a spending bill are yet to be made public. But U.S. media reports that it gives President Donald Trump a $12.5 billion increase in defense spending and another $1.5 billion for border security. White House proposals to cut popular programs, such as funding medical research and community development grants, were rejected. Democrats also fended off potential cuts to women's healthcare provider Planned Parenthood. New York City will reportedly receive a $68 million boost for local law enforcement, in recompense for the cost of protecting President Trump and his family. The deal also gives coal miners $1.3 billion in health benefits, which will be funded by a rise in customs fees. Why couldn't Republicans just force it through? There were a number of key disputes during tense negotiations, and Republicans, who control the Congress, Senate and White House, were forced to make concessions. Democrats had leverage in the talks because their votes will be needed to pass the bill. The Senate requires 60 votes to pass legislation, so the 52 Republicans there will need support from at least 8 Democrats. President Trump earlier had to yield to Democratic demands not to include funding for the proposed wall on the U.S.-Mexico border in the spending bill. Another concession was over Obamacare, formerly known as the Affordable Care Act. Mr. Trump made scrapping it a key campaign pledge, but divisions among Republicans have so far prevented attempts to get his own health plan through Congress. In a statement on Sunday evening, Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer called the deal a good agreement for the American people that takes the threat of a government shutdown off the table. He said the measure would increase investment in medical research, education, and infrastructure. Reports that the package makes a major down payment towards the president's security priorities are encouraging, said John Swartacki, a spokesman for the White House Office of Management and Budget. Congressional negotiators have reached an agreement on a spending bill to keep the U.S. government running until 30 September, reported BBC. The bipartisan deal boosts military spending but does not include funding for President Donald Trump's proposed wall on the Mexico border, they say. The reported $1 trillion deal, £770 billion, needs to be approved by lawmakers. Lawmakers are expected to vote on the package in the coming days. Congressional negotiators on Sunday reached an agreement to fund the U.S. government through the end of September, 3 congressional aides told USA Today, averting a government shutdown at the end of this week. The deal includes $15 billion in extra funding for defense programs, which is half of the $30 billion that President Trump asked for in his emergency request to Congress. It also includes $1.5 billion in extra money for border security, but not the $1.4 billion Trump wanted to begin construction of a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border. And it includes $2 billion in extra funding for the National Institutes of Health, which Democrats were pushing for, according to a source with the Senate Appropriations Committee. The House and Senate are expected to vote on the package by Thursday. On Friday, Congress passed a stopgap funding bill that kept the government open for another week, giving lawmakers until midnight May 5 to try to reach a compromise on legislation to fund the government through fiscal 2017, which ends September 30. Negotiators from the House and Senate Appropriations Committees worked through the weekend to reach a deal. After details of the agreement emerged Sunday night, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, DNY, released a statement saying the deal reflects the Democrats' principles. The bill ensures taxpayer dollars aren't used to fund an ineffective border wall, excludes poison pill riders, and increases investments in programs that the middle class relies on, like medical research, education, and infrastructure. White House Budget Director Mick Mulvaney said earlier in April that the shutdown fight was the first real test of whether or not the Democrats, specifically in the Senate, were interested in negotiating, interested in compromising. The White House last week dropped its demand for immediate funding for the border wall after Democrats said it would result in a government shutdown because they would not vote for any bill that included it. The White House also dropped its threat to stop paying federal subsidies to insurance companies that offer lower-cost coverage to low-income Americans. Trump had threatened to stop paying the subsidies to force Democrats to support legislation to replace the Affordable Care Act, better known as Obamacare. Once those two major stumbling blocks to a deal were removed, negotiators had just a few remaining issues to resolve over the weekend. While Republicans hold majorities in the House and Senate, the GOP needs Democratic votes in both chambers to pass the funding bill. In the closely divided Senate, the GOP has a slim majority of 52 seats in a chamber where 60 votes are required to pass the legislation. In the House, Republican leaders need help from Democrats because some conservatives will oppose any bill that increases spending. Democrats used that leverage to get concessions from the White House on the border wall and Obamacare while also getting extra money for medical research and other domestic programs. At the same time, Democrats agreed to beef up defense and border security, allowing the White House to claim at least a partial victory. We have eliminated more than 160 Republican poison pill riders, ranging from undermining a woman's right to reproductive health to dismantling Dodd-Frank's vital Wall Street consumer protections, House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, Democrat California, said in a statement late Sunday. The omnibus funding bill does not fund President Trump's immoral and unwise border wall or create a cruel new deportation force. Pelosi said the bill includes more than $1 billion in permanent health benefits for retired coal miners and their families, additional funds to fight the epidemic of opioid addiction, and more money for Puerto Rico's Medicaid program, which was expected to run out of funds this year. It also restores student access to year-round Pell Grants to help pay colleges' tuition and provides funding for federal highways and wildfire prevention, Pelosi said. Negotiators in the U.S. Congress reached a deal late on Sunday on around $1 trillion in federal funding that would avert a government shutdown later this week, while handing President Donald Trump a down payment on his promised military buildup. The full House of Representatives and Senate must still approve the bipartisan pact, which would be the first major legislation to clear Congress since Trump became president on January 20. Prompt passage of the legislation was expected this week. The funds, which should have been locked into place 7 months ago with the start of fiscal 2017 on October 1, would pay for an array of federal programs from airport and border security operations to soldiers' pay, medical research, foreign aid, space exploration, and education. The agreement will move the needle forward on conservative priorities and will ensure that the essential functions of the federal government are maintained, said Jennifer Hing, a spokeswoman for Republicans on the House Appropriations Committee. If it is not enacted by midnight Friday, federal agencies would have to lay off hundreds of thousands of workers and require many others to continue on the job providing law enforcement and other essential operations without pay until the funding dispute in Congress is resolved. This agreement is a good agreement for the American people and takes the threat of a government shutdown off the table, Senate Democratic Leader Chuck Schumer said in a statement. He said the measure would increase federal investments in medical research, education, and infrastructure. House and Senate appropriators worked into the night to draft the legislation for lawmakers to review. A senior congressional aide said the Pentagon would win a $12.5 billion increase in defense spending for the fiscal year that ends on September 30, with the possibility of an additional $2.5 billion contingent on Trump delivering a plan to Congress for defeating the Islamic State militant group. Trump had requested $30 billion more in military funds for this year after campaigning hard on a defense build-up during the 2016 election campaign. No wall money. Several other important White House initiatives were rejected by the Republican and Democratic negotiators, including money for a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border that Trump has argued is needed to stop illegal immigrants and drugs. Instead, congressional negotiators settled on $1.5 billion more for border security, including more money for new technology and repairing existing infrastructure, the aide said. The Trump administration had earlier backed away from a threat to end federal subsidies for low-income people to get health insurance through Obamacare, the program that Trump had pledged to repeal. Republicans are struggling over a repeal and replacement plan for former President Barack Obama's landmark health care law, and it was unclear whether they would be able to bring such legislation to the House floor soon. While Republicans control the House, Senate, and White House, Democrats scored other significant victories in the deal. Puerto Rico will get an emergency injection of $295 million in additional funding for its Medicaid health insurance program for the poor, according to the aide who asked not to be identified. The impoverished island, which is a U.S. territory, is facing a severe Medicaid funding shortfall. Democrats also fended off potential cuts to women's healthcare provider Planned Parenthood, while House Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi applauded a nearly $2 billion hike in funds for the National Institutes of Health this year. Coal miners and their families facing the loss of health insurance next month would get a permanent renewal under the spending bill. While Trump has urged Congress to impose deep cuts to the Environmental Protection Agency, most of its programs would be continued for at least the remainder of this year, according to the aide. The House is likely to vote first on the package, probably early in the week, and send the measure to the Senate for approval before Friday's midnight deadline. If the legislation is enacted by week's end, Congress would then have to begin focusing on a series of bills to fund the government at the start of the next fiscal year on October 1.